Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Create webinar this evening. My name's Michael Anderson, and I'm co-director with Professor Emerita Robin Ewing of the Create Centre at the University of Sydney. For those of you who don't know, the Create Centre is a centre within the University of Sydney that is devoted to applying the art across the community. So applying arts and creativity in the health sector, in schools, in education, etc., etc. And one of the things that we like to do is bring together people to hear ideas in the arts that are bubbling up that come from our partners and different people across the arts community. So if in fact you're interested in hearing more of this work, Anna will drop a link in the chat, which gives you a link to the Create Centre where you can go and sign up and become a member for free. And you'll become also apprised of all of the things that we do through our newsletter. So everyone's really welcome to do that. I'm going to introduce Sonia in a second, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge that this and all of us are on, or at least all of us in Australia are on Aboriginal land. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I want to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So tonight, we've got a real treat in store. Sonia de Freitas is a creative educator who's served in various roles that span art management, media production, and teaching. Currently, she's the head of education and communities at the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, where she works with a skilled and dedicated team to make an impact on classrooms and teaching in music-loving communities. And I think it's no overstatement to say that there are music-loving communities throughout New South Wales and Australia, but we would love to see more. And some of what Sonia's work is doing, and I'm sure she'll talk about tonight, is actually generating more of those music-loving communities. So anyway, enough from me. Thanks very much, Sonia, for doing our webinar this evening, and I look forward to hearing what you have for it. Thanks, Sonia.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Anna, for all your work putting this together. I'm just going to share my screen, so if you don't mind giving me a moment before I get into everything in earnest. Excellent. Great. Before I get into it, I'd also like to acknowledge and give my respect to the Gadigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which I'm presenting. A warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present on the webinar or who are watching the video later on. This evening, I'm presenting from Waterloo, which borders Redfern. Both of these suburbs are significant to Indigenous people. There are a few important landmarks that I'd like to point out. First, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Primary School at Waterloo, originally known as the Waterloo Estate School when it opened back in 1858, is one of Sydney's oldest Catholic schools, and today about half of its students are from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. The Waterloo Town Hall was converted into a library in the early 1970s. The Kuri Collection is a dedicated Aboriginal history collection held at the library, which was officially launched in July 2007 as part of NAIDOC Week. It comprises over 1,250 fiction and non-fiction items on Australian, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander history. Last, Redfern Park. It was the site of a speech given by the former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating on the 10th of December 1992 to launch the Year of the Indigenous Person. Subsequently referred to as the Redfern speech, it focused on reconciliation and was the first acknowledgement of a Commonwealth government of the dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If you'd like to learn more about landmarks in Sydney, jump onto sydneybarani.com.au. So hello and welcome, everybody. I am Sonia, and I've worked in the arts and music management, media and education for the past 15 years or so. I've been practicing as a teacher, a producer, manager, leader, writer, performer, and thinker, and definitely an overthinker, I would add. In early 2023, I completed my Master of Education Learning and Leadership at UTS. And through my coursework subjects, creativity was the golden thread that as we delved into topics such as learning design, leading innovative practice, data and ethics, mentoring, and more. And I'm totally fascinated by what creativity means and how it happens and what it looks like. And sadly, I so often hear friends and family say, oh, I'm not creative. And it really bothers me when people say this, because I believe that we are all creative, and I believe creativity is inseparable to our human experience. Creativity helps us engage our innate curiosity, inventiveness, individuality, and expression. However, I think that creativity is often shrouded in smoke and mystery, like the opening sequence of a horror film. What if I ask you to improvise something creative right now? You can dance, sing, write a poem, have a creative thought, make an origami animal, go for it. Now, many of you may have felt a little pang of anxiety because you might not know where to start, or you might not think that you are creative or how to be creative. Now, I might also be so bold as to say that many of you took a gasping breath in because you thought I was going to ask you to have a show and tell and put you on the spot. Don't worry, I won't do that through this presentation. But I hope by the end of my small-scale research presentation, you might find creative practice more interesting and exciting rather than daunting or scary, if that's the way you might feel, by seeing it from a new perspective. Now, before I get into my topic in earnest, I have a little quiz for you to do. So if you don't mind taking your phones out and scanning the QR code, click the link and participate. And Anna very kindly will drop the link in the chat as well, if that's helpful for you. Please choose the creative practitioner you think best aligns with the described practice. There are 4 creative practitioners described: an arts manager, a composer, photographer, and an architect. And I'll reveal your answers later on in my talk. Well, let's get into it. So in this presentation, Decoding Creative Practice, we're going to cover the following ideas. The idea of practice. We're going to take a look at Nick Hopwood's Time, Spaces, Bodies, Things framework for practice. We're going to learn about the interview to the double, and we'll take a look at the practice of 4 creative practitioners. You may be familiar with the output of the painter Van Gogh, the curvy architecture of Zaha Hadid, or the mind-melting guitar solos of Slash. Through their careers, I'm sure these artists were asked that all-important question: what is your process? I'd like to dig a little deeper and ask, what is your practice? I want to know how artists and thinkers are creative. What do we need to be creative? What do we do when we are being creative? And are we creative in the same way? To delve into these questions, I interviewed 4 creative practitioners using a method pioneered by Silvia Garadi and David Nicolini called the interview to the double. Given that I couldn't get hold of Slash's management, Zaha Hadid's office didn't return my calls, and Van Gogh is obviously from another century, I identified the following 4 creative practitioners within my network, described in duality as an arts manager trumpeter, a composer performer, a photographer beatboxer, and an architect designer. Always quite interesting to me that they describe themselves not in just one kind of facet. I then produced a transcript of the interview, and I analyzed these transcripts using Nick Hopwood's Time, Spaces, Bodies, Things practice framework to decode their creative practice. But what is practice? In his 2013 article, Practice Theory, Work and Organization, David Niccolini notes that a unified practice theory does not exist. Practice theories constitute a rather broad family of theoretical approaches. Furthermore, the appeal of what has been variably described as practice idiom, practice standpoint, practice lens, and a practice-based approach lies in its capacity to describe important features of the world we inhabit as something that is routinely made and remade in practice using tools, discourse, and our bodies. From this perspective, the social world appears as a vast array or assemblage of performance made durable by being inscribed in human bodies and minds, objects, text, and knotted together in such a way that the results of one performance becomes the resource for another. The attraction of the practice idiom stems in particular from its capacity to resonate with the contemporary experience that our world is increasingly in flux and interconnected. And I'd like to underline that word interconnected. It's an important one. Both Niccolini and Gherardi see practice as connectedness in action. The time, spaces, bodies, things framework that Nick Hopwood developed is but one way to look at practice and how these elements are connected. He argues that the connectedness or texture has essential temporal, spatial, bodily, and material dimensions. In other words, time, spaces, bodies, things. These dimensions are essential, but often rendered invisible in dominant accounts of work and learning. Now, who better to hear from than Nick himself explain a little more about his time, spaces, bodies, things framework. Have a listen.
Hello, my name is Nick Hopwood. I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney, and this is a short video about a theoretical framework that I developed and have been using in research that's often referred to in terms of its 4 key concepts: times, spaces, bodies, and things. This isn't an in-depth theoretical explanation, but rather a guide to working with these ideas, particularly to understand professional practice and learning. So firstly, some key points about these concepts, and these points apply to all 4 of the main ideas. Each of them, when I say time, spaces, bodies, and things, I do mean what you think you'd mean in a kind of an everyday sense. So time, the time that gets used up that is on clocks and things like that. Spaces, the spaces we inhabit, that we work in and live in. Bodies, I mean our bodies, and things, I mean stuff you can touch and lift up, and hold, and yeah, but more than that as well. And so these other 3 points expand on that more than part. When I'm interested in them, I'm really interested, because of the practice theory background to this framework, in how they are enacted. They're not just things that kind of exist outside of the things that people do in their lives. So I'm suggesting that times come into being through the practices that we pursue in our everyday lives and in our work. Times come to matter through practices and the things that we do in life. Same with spaces. It's not just a container that we inhabit. Spaces are made, they are enacted through the things we do, the things we say, and where we relate to one another. All of these things, I use the word in plural form, and that's to signal 2 things. One is that there's not just one version of each concept. Like in times, I don't just mean like clock time or pacing or rhythm or other things like that. There are lots of different notions of time and temporality that come up when we're understanding practices. Same with spaces, bodies, and things. But there are also multiple versions of these that can co-occur together. Now, this comes out of something that Nigel Thrift would call non-representational theory. But it's not like there's one right answer to say what are the spatial aspects of the practices that I'm looking at today. There might be many different spaces being enacted right at the same time, and the kind of multiplicity can co-occur, so that and lots of different arguments about the kind of spaces that are being produced, more than one space at more than one time. The same things for bodies, things, etc. And finally, that each of these 4 things overlaps with the other 3. They're not exclusive. So it's not like when you look at times, spaces, bodies, and things disappear. Absolutely the opposite. I'm going to say that they're subtly separated points of departure. I'm going to say a bit more about that.
Great. Now that we have a shared understanding of practice, or the approach I've taken for this specific study, let's jump back to the interview method I used to understand creative practice. As mentioned earlier, I used a unique method of interviewing called the interview to the double, pioneered by Silvia Gerardi and David Niccolini. Niccolini succinctly describes this method as follows. This is the technique that requires interviewees to imagine they have a double who will have to replace them at their job the very next day. The informant is then asked to provide the necessary detailed instructions which will ensure that the ploy is not unveiled and the double is not unmasked. In an interview with the lecturer from UTS, Gerardi explains that the interview to the double helps us understand the nuances and individual idiosyncrasies of practice, echoing Hopwood's sentiment that temporal, spatial, bodily, and material dimensions are often rendered invisible when describing work. The time, spaces, bodies, things framework enables us to see the details. In order to get to this fine detail, the interview to the double requires a trust relationship with the interviewee so that the smaller details of practice are shared, but not too close a relationship that the detail is neglected. The interview to the double has to be conducted with a specific time frame in mind so that when the interviewee is describing their day or week or hour of work, it doesn't become just a broad overview of the work. And the interviewer should help the interviewee describe their practice in as much detail as possible by asking clarifying questions along the way. From my 4 interviews, I generated a transcript for each, which I then analyzed by categorizing what they had to say into the time, spaces, bodies, things framework, as shown on the right of your screen. By applying Hopwood's practice theory, I could then generate insights into creative practice and process, and thereby suggest emerging claims on what creative practice is and looks like for an individual. Before I delve into the details of my creative practitioner interviews, let's take a look at the results of our quiz. Thank you for participating. So for the first practitioner, this person seems to focus on their embodied experience, their state of mind, daydreaming, having an idea and a vision. Close to 50% of you picked the composer. About 23% of you picked the photographer. About 15% picked the architect, somewhere around there. And then for the second practitioner, this person is ritual focused, which seemed to impact the arrangements of their things, and the way that their room is set up impacts their ability to be creative. This was a real mixed bag. About a third of you chose the architect. About 25% of you chose the photographer, and then a very small portion chose the composer, and about 25% chose the arts manager. Next, creative practitioner. This person focused their time on preparing their things and ensuring that there is time to improvise. They had many things to set up in their space. Most of you said the photographer, and so that was close to 40%. And then about a third of you said the composer, a smaller portion the architect, and an even smaller portion the arts manager. And lastly, this person is deadline driven and closely manages their time in their practice. They have to get into the right mental state before undertaking their detailed work. Over 50% of you chose the arts manager. A third of you chose the architect. And then, the rest chose kind of an equal portion, the composer and the, who else is left? Oh no, nobody, it was just those 3 that were chosen, actually. That's very interesting. Wow, I was not expecting those results. Quite a mixed bag. Great. So And now all will be revealed in these early insights from the 4 practitioners that I interviewed. So let's get into it. So the composer seemed to focus on their embodied experience, their state of mind, daydreaming, having an idea and a vision. On the right-hand side is a bit of a word cloud from their transcript with some kind of keywords that they might stand out to you, that you can have a look at as I read. From a times perspective, it was fascinating to hear how that factored into how they produced their compositional content. They would produce a musical content of about a minute at a time, and before continuing, they would seek input from other professionals that they respect. They also needed a lot of time for cogitation and to settle their ideas, as well as having time for a break from a work, so a break from the work, so that they could come back later and pick it up again. So that rest time was important to them. Now, for the arts manager trumpeter, they were more ritual focused, and they seemed to be impacted by the arrangement of their things in space. So from a things or material perspective, how their room is set up impacted their ability to be creative. Interestingly, they applied a similar practice to their arts management work to create content, as well as their trumpet playing. So it was all about how they organized their things in space. The photographer beatboxer had a strong pull to the material aspects, as you might imagine, with all of their gadgets and things. They needed to set up their equipment in space, and interestingly, they tried to minimize their time preparing things to maximize their time to improvise. Improvisation was hugely important for this creative practitioner. And they like to think on their feet a lot, and used words such as dumb experimenting, which I really appreciated, amongst other things, to describe the way that they improvise. And there's some other interesting words and phrases that they use that kind of stand out in that word cloud. So improvisation was integral to their creative practice. And last, the architect was very deadline and time-driven in their practice. And they used music and podcasts to help them get into the right mental state before undertaking their detailed work. So that's kind of a broad overview of the outcome of those interview to the doubles and the analysis with the time, spaces, bodies, things framework. And for the purposes of this presentation, I want to delve a little deeper into 2 of these creative practitioners and do a bit of a side-by-side comparison along the way as we step through each of those dimensions. So I've also extracted a few supporting quotations from from the transcript that align to each of the dimensions. For the composer, things were not always physically tangible, but rather lay in the inspirations that they had for their compositions. So astronomy was an inspiration for them. They were inspired by planets. We can't touch the planets, but we know they're there. We know they exist. They are things. And the stars as well, and constellations. The practically tangible things that they did have were the instruments, such as the piano and the flute, their writing materials, whether it was manuscript paper or notation software such as Sibelius on their computer. For the arts manager trumpeter, it was important for them to ritualistically arrange their things in their space. For example, they said, "It's a medium-sized room. I'm always standing with the music stand in the corner of the room, so the trumpet is always facing the corner of the room. Natural light is important to them, and obviously their instrument, the trumpet, is important. And when developing music education teaching materials, they would always have a big mind map of their topic up on the wall." Now taking a closer look at spaces. The composer-performer had a flow between online and physical spaces for their composing, saying it kind of flows. I wrote on Sibelius and then at the piano as well, and they did both. They also had to consider the physical space of the performers for whom they write music, because this impacts the way that they compose and create their work. So they said things like, "I spent some time thinking about how I could fit 3 flutes in front of an orchestra." Now, for the arts manager trumpeter, interestingly, they use the same space for both their trumpet practice and their arts management work. So they'll move things around and arrange things differently in the space as they switch between their different modes of work. They sit at their desk in order to conduct their arts management work, and the same natural light is important to them, but the arrangement of things might be different in the space. Taking a closer look at the body's dimension. So for the composer-performer, they spoke a lot about their state of mind and having a clear vision. The vision behind the composition is important. And this person spends a lot of time meditating, researching something they're interested in, and so on to progress their practice. This creative practitioner is often engaged in an introspective, internalized process. The arts manager trumpeter was sensitive to how they were feeling at a particular time of day. So they would associate particular tasks or activities with a time of day, using their morning freshness, as they describe, for their creativity and doing other tasks later on in the day. They also talk about how their rituals aid their practice. For example, if they haven't done their trumpet warm-up, then the day doesn't feel as positive. So the sense of routine and ritual is very important to this creative practitioner. And some other embodied activities that they undertook included researching. From a times perspective, this was a particularly interesting differentiation between the two creative practitioners. The composer-performer spoke about flow, a common term a lot of artists use. How their time was basically divided up into a multitude of different tasks and activities and space to cogitate. There seemed to be an organic emergence of activity rather than a predetermined plan. They would say about their compositional process, sometimes it will come to me straight away. Sometimes it might take a few weeks, but once I have the idea, then the piece writes itself. For the arts manager trumpeter, they were far more routined and predetermined with their time, saying, as a very busy musician and creative practitioner, I guess I'm approaching it with time and efficiency. Their double would need to be very routined to go undetected, and the arts manager trumpeter is rigorous in how much time they allow for particular activities, such as 15 minutes for their trumpet warm-up. And they use the times of day to maximize their creativity. From the analysis that I conducted on creative practice of my two chosen creative practitioners, I think we are able to just start answering those key questions. How are artists and thinkers creative? What do we need to be creative? What do we do when we are being creative? And are we creative in the same way? I think that last question has a very clear answer already. Here are my suggested emerging claims. First, creative practice is experienced differently and is personal to the practitioner. Creative practice is a multifaceted activity. Embodied activity is sometimes invisible, like when somebody is daydreaming or just thinking to ideate, while other activity is more tangible and interacts with the world around them, such as research, mind mapping, and physical practice of musical instruments. Creative practitioners depend on either an organic sense of time where there's a flow, or they depend on routine and ritual. And by strategically using time, they maximize their state of mind and their creative output. Last, from the study, I believe that the interview to the double is a useful means of capturing creative practice, as it allows the practitioner to describe the nuances of their work that might not otherwise be captured. I must also acknowledge the limitations of this very small scale study and the need for future research. The sample group that I had is too small to make any broad claims on creative practice as a whole. And this study has focused on the intrapersonal aspects of creative practice, not the interpersonal and collaborative aspects of creative practice. The creative practitioners are from different disciplines, so naturally this leads to variation in their creative practice. And while I specified that the creative practitioners should describe one day in their next week, each day of their month might look different. And as for future research, I want to continue decoding creativity by increasing the number of interviews with individual creative practitioners to understand their practice and how it may change over those days, weeks, and months, and so forth. I want to interview many, many more creative practitioners. I'd like to interview people in professions that are not conventionally understood as creative and explore where the similarities and differences occur. I think that would be totally fascinating and kind of jump back to my point that we're all creative, just in different ways. I'd like to understand creative practice from the lens of other practice frameworks, such as Stephen Chemis's theory of practice architectures. This is of particular interest to me because it's a useful framework to use to understand the enablers and the constraints of practice by looking at the cultural, discursive, material, economics, and socio-political aspects and where they overlap. So to recap, in the study that has offered me the opportunity to explore a methodology to decode creative practice, we covered the idea of practice and why it is hard to define. We delved into Nick Hopwood's Time, Spaces, Bodies, Things framework as an approach to understanding practice. We covered how the interview to the double works and why it is a useful tool in understanding creative practice. We took a closer look at the creative practice of 4 creative practitioners and compared a couple of them too. Oh, and we did a quiz, and you all got gold stars for the quiz. And it would be remiss of me as an educator not to have a moment of reflection. So in this part of the presentation, I'd love for you to have a look at a performance by the percussionist Claire Edwards of Ensemble Offspring, chosen because it's a solo work on an instrument you might not have heard perform solo before, and she performs an Australian work by Lachlan Skipwood. So it's all living music by Australian composers. I'd like you to consider the 4 dimensions of Nick Hopwood's Time, Spaces, Bodies, Things framework. You might even grab a pen and piece of paper and draw those quadrants and take some notes as we go. Or just use your phone to jot down a few notes. I'd like you to think about what you notice about this musician's creative practice according to each of those dimensions. You could have a listen to this beautiful work, Ocean Pulse, composed by Lachlan Skipworth and performed by Claire Edwards of Ensemble Offspring, and think about the Time, Spaces, Bodies, Things framework as you're listening and watching. having had the opportunity to have a look at the time, spaces, bodies, things, would you like to share some of what you've observed about creative practice using this particular lens, going into as much detail as you possibly can? Yes, perfect.
With the headphones. I think Claire is amazing the way she uses her body, and her body is the music.
Yeah.
Embodies the music, and it's so it's a visual, it's beautiful to watch as well as to listen to. It's very graceful the way she uses her body, and the way the mallets move is just mesmerizing. Such a skill.
Yeah, absolutely. The embodiment of the music is massive in her creative presentation of it. Anybody else want to share anything from the dimensions, time, spaces, bodies, things? Bella.
Hello. Yeah, kind of following on from what Sue said, like her being the music. I wrote underneath times flow and growing, because I felt that it started off quite slow and then you can kind of see how she gets in the flow of it. So I feel like that kind of encapsulated it all for me, the feeling of flow and growing and movement as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other descriptions of time, spaces, bodies, things? On times, I also wrote the very obvious that the whole work is 10 minutes. That's a very tangible, that is the amount of time. And then the moments of music move faster and slower. There are quick notes and then slow notes as you listen. And I guess if I had to interview Claire, it might be interesting to understand what her perception of time would be in that flow. Do those 10 minutes feel like clock 10 minutes, or does it feel like 10 seconds to her? Any other descriptions? Fiona.
One thing I found very interesting was that using this framework, you start to think about things that you may not otherwise, that you just accept as normal. So the space was an extremely traditional white cube space, where it, you sort of imagine it maybe played in nature, or something with a little bit more resonance. Like it was a very it really focused on the performer, but it would be also interesting to know how much that space informed the acoustic presentation of the work and flattened it, maybe, because it didn't look like a space designed for the presentation of acoustic work.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation for the space. And yes, that tradition of there's that very clear audience performer setup. So all the focus is on, so that, and the creativity is that is somebody made a decision to have it set up in that way for that purpose. So it's a deliberate choice to have that. And this lens, like you said, Fiona, it really helps you think about those dimensions individually. And like Nick Hopwood says, they're all present at the same time. They're all hanging there together. But if you take one as a point of departure, it makes you see something in a different way, or think about, why did somebody make that choice? Oh, it was a deliberate choice. What if I change it? How does that change the creative presentation? Like you say, if it were a performance out in nature, then maybe it wouldn't be about the performer and that particular music in that space. It would be maybe you're looking at the environment a little bit more, or it's quite curious. Anybody else want to share what they observed? Zoe.
There's a couple of notes there's a couple of notes from Jeremy in the chat if you'd like to read those out after Zoe's.
Oh, great. Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Zoe.
Hello. I was actually thinking a lot about how her space would have been in the process, the rehearsal process. So I'm fascinated by how she would have related to her rehearsal space in building the work. And that in relation to all the other things as well, I think we saw that really polished performance, but how does the creative process play out in those quadrants? Yeah, when it's in preparation as opposed to presentation.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, because like, how does that space activate us into that performance mode? That would be a curious thing if I had to take this further and do an interview to the double with her. And how does your mindset change when you're walking into a space that's clearly set up for rehearsal versus a performance venue that has that uplift or a bit of nervousness? Who knows? Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. And to go into Jeremy's suggestions over here, so for things, deliberate choice of performance outfit. Yes, I was looking at that as well. The earrings, the dance around reflects the light, and the dress is equally a composition of shapes. Yeah, you know, often performers will choose very particular outfits for their performance. They're trying to communicate something through their outfits. So that's a really important part of the presentation, and something creative in itself. You know, another question, because I work at the Sydney Symphony, you know, is why do the musicians always dress in black? So, but for this performance, it's new, living Australian music. Maybe it's got to do with that vibrancy. It's something a bit different, a bit experimental. So maybe that's why the outfit reflects that. But again, that's just me, you know, hypothesizing, I guess. Let's see, anything else in the chats? Oh, Jeremy also said something about space. The well-lit space, yes, I was also thinking about the lights, adds to the levity of the composition, distance to the audience. It's very close and intimate, without distractions. Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. The fact that there weren't that many things around to distract you was a deliberate choice too, or a creative choice. Positioning of the musical instrument is central on the stage, seeking our attention. That is so great. I love that.
I just find it interesting too, because I thought of space completely differently. And I thought of it from a musical point of view of how she was, again, it was related to her body, but, you know, how she held the mallets in space, and whether the mallets were making big movements or tiny movements, and how she was moving up and down the instrument. And, you know, even I was really interested to see where her legs were, her balance within the space. Yeah, so I was kind of looking at how the space influenced the sound. And I'm always fascinated by how they can hold full mallets and play the correct notes and manipulate the mallets in space, you know. So mine was kind of related more to the music and the playing techniques.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about this framework as well, how Nick Hopwood is quite explicit about that, the plurality of each dimension. It doesn't have to, it can mean many different things, and it really helps you think through what all of those different things are and could be. Bernie, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Further to what Sue contributed, I was thinking about the connection between bodies and things, and the way Claire's body becomes an extension of the instrument and how she moves. It's wonderful. And she had such a buoyancy to her movement.
Absolutely. And it's and like well, many of us were saying before, she is the music, like her body is the music, and it's the story of the music as well, because it's called Ocean Pulse, and you definitely get that sense of flow and the water moving in that way. I also found it quite interesting how her, like from an embodiment perspective, how her eyes were always focused on the iPad, and the rest of her body kind of knew instinctively where to go. That's a really interesting creative practice. It's like partially muscle memory and that kind of sense of flow, and not thinking arduously about where your hands need to go, but also keeping that like super focus on, yeah, looking at the notation, and having that sense of focus, I guess, when performing. Alrighty, well, thank you so much for participating in that discussion. Now, I do invite you, when I get that right, yes. So now I invite you to hold up a mirror to yourself and think about your own creative practice, because yes, every single one of us is creative. And consider it through the lens of Hopwood's time, spaces, bodies, things framework. Does it help you notice something different about your own creative practice? Does it help you better understand practice? And if you had to change one of these dimensions for yourself in your own creative practice, what might happen to your creative practice? And these are all the references I had for this presentation. And lastly, just a thank you so much for listening and being here this evening. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn or be in touch with the Create Center team if you would like my contact details. I'd love to keep the conversation going, and I'd love to delve deeper into this topic with further research. And now it's question time. Do you have any questions about my presentation, or would you like to share anything about your own creative practice, or perhaps something in my presentation triggered a thought for you? Bella.
Hello again.
Hello.
This might be a really broad question, but I'm wondering, let me just put my hand down, that's annoying me. I'm wondering what you think are the main implications from your research. So whether that be in like education, in terms of how we kind of inspire creativity, what do you think the implications are of it?
That's such a great question. I actually took some notes down about what the implications and why we should be looking at this in this way. So when I was undertaking my master's, we were approaching practice theory from a learning perspective. So we were looking at practice theory, understanding all these dimensions to understand where learning takes place. So we weren't specifically looking at creativity, but rather where learning occurs. And learning occurs when there's a change in these dimensions, or if somebody reaches a roadblock in one of these dimensions. So it's just a helpful tool to help us think through really thoroughly where those roadblocks or where those changes happen. So that could be an implication. We could learn how to be more creative by understanding these different dimensions. Like by, for example, in our exercise there where we were looking at Claire Edwards' practice, understanding how the space was arranged. Maybe that's something you could learn from and you could take into your own practice. So I guess it's that deep observation and learning. Some other implications are, how we can improve our creative practice by thinking about it in this really deep way. New ways of learning and understanding practice, demystifying the creative practice. I often see artists, because I'm privileged to work in this space and in my own creative practice as well. There's so much process and tedium that actually goes along with creative practice, and sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we think people just sit around and have thought bubbles and that's the only thing that happens. That is part of creative practice, but there are other things that happen as well. So I think by, the interview to the double allows us to really get into the nitty-gritty of what that practice is. Like, this person needs 3 cups of coffee every single morning before they can even open their study book. That's actually part of their creative practice. They need 3 cups of coffee. So maybe you can try 3 cups of coffee as well in your own practice. I don't recommend. It's probably not good for your heart. And another thing that's important, and I think this kind of relates to what Zoe was talking about when you're thinking of how somebody might interact with a space for a rehearsal versus a performance. It's how can we retain our practice when our environment changes as well. So I think that's another important implication when we understand creative practice a little more. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think that point about it really, if we think about your presentation as part of your creative practice, then because it's presented on Zoom, it's very different from in real life. Mm-hmm. And we, in my opinion anyway, we haven't really come to grips yet with those differences and what the impacts are on how the audience interacts with both you and the material and how we learn from it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not a one-to-one, you know, if I were to do this presentation in a live format, presumably there would be some sort of front spot that I would stand, and there would be a screen, and you would sit at tables or maybe just chairs, who knows. And the level of interaction would be different because I'd see you all the time. When it's on the computer, I can't see how you're responding. So I'm alone talking in my room. So it's a bit awkward sometimes because you're just talking to yourself, really. But then again, it's also like taking a level of interaction that you know in creative practice you have when you are in person, and then trying to translate that into a digital sense. So for example, having the little poll, that's just a way to engage and be connected in a digital sense, and using the chat feature and so on. So it's like, what can we enable and transfer from one creative practice in a space to another space that's vastly different? So yeah, it's really interesting.
I appreciate your little grid, just because it makes me think that if we decode in that way for ourselves, and something, you mentioned roadblocks, and something does go wrong, you could look at the grid and just try changing a thing. And I know that getting stuck is something that a lot of creative practitioners worry about. So thank you for the pathway to to figuring out how one might, yes, just attempt an adjustment that might affect that. Have you applied that to your own work at all?
In my practice, well, actually, yes, since I started with understanding this time, spaces, bodies, things, I mean, I can't help but think about my own practice and how I arrange things and what I need to be creative. And like something, I don't know if you notice in my space, but lighting is actually really important to me. I hate big, bright fluorescent lights that get really distracting and bothersome for me. So even just before this presentation, I need to set up my space in a way that looks organized. Usually my desk for work is like pretty messy because I just have books everywhere and like a post-it note there and scribbling notes and everywhere. But actually before this session, I had to physically clear my space almost as a way of clearing my mind. And then I had to set my lights. I've got my little nice glowy lights that make me feel calm and stuff so I can present. So yeah, I think it really does. It really helps me think about those steps outside of actually doing the creative thing. It's actually part of your process, how you set up your space, how you arrange your things, how you make yourself feel, and also the time it takes to do all of that. So yeah, it's really helped me, I think, thinking in that way.
And Katie has just asked in the chat if you've published anything or if it's on its way.
Oh, no, I have not published anything, but I would love to in the future. So I hope to take this further in whatever format of study I can, or even an informal article or something like that. But, you know, I'm sure, well, just stay in touch. And if I do have anything, I will let you know. Oh, shucks. Thank you so much. Thank you, Katie. Yeah, I think creativity is really important to keep delving into. And I know, you know, on a broader scale, I think creativity is important to all of us because it helps us process the world. AI will never be able to do it the same way that humans can. So, you know, I don't think we actually have to ever worry about that whole AI thing because we are so creative on such a deep and meaningful level that I don't think it's easy to replicate that deep and meaningful level at all. Yeah, and so it's really important to understand creativity. It makes us human.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been really eye-opening. I teach primary teachers and in the creative arts, and this framework I think has such a potential to demystify what it is when we're creative, and I just the practical application is really phenomenal. I can't wait to share these ideas, so I'll keep an eye out. I can't wait to see your published work.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Katie. That's yeah, that's exciting. Lovely. Well, I think I might throw it back to Matthew and Anna then.
Thanks
sorry,
very
Michael
much. No, love being called Matthew. Thanks very much,
Sorry.
Sonia. Don't worry about it. Thanks so much, Sonia. That was such a insightful and thoughtful presentation. I love the way that you wound in Hemis's work and kind of inside and outside of education. It's really exciting, the kind of work that's being done. And I agree, there's so much potential in that framework to demystify creativity and help people, as you say, understand that creativity is an inherency. It's part of what we're born with. So thank you so much. And on behalf of everyone who came along tonight, thanks so much. And we look forward to hearing more in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to listen. And yeah, just be in touch. I love to have a chat about creativity.